Scarper is a two-player wargame set on the Western Front during World War I. In a game of Scarper, one player takes command of the German forces, and the other player takes command of the Allied forces.
Thanks for checking out this video on how to play Scarper. First, let me introduce the component pieces. To play a game of Scarper, you'll need the game board, which is a map of the Western Front. You'll need the marker sheet, but I'll explain those as we go through them. You will need a rule book. You'll need a rules reference. Well, I guess you don't really need it, but it does make the game a whole lot easier. Furthermore, you'll need strategy cards, blue for the Allies, red for the Germans. You'll need trenches, which you can either use game cubes, like I do, or you can use the brown markers on the marker sheet. And you'll need the event cards. Now, event cards come in three different colors. You have the red, which are associated with a German player. You have blue, which are associated with the Allied player. And then you have green cards, which are not necessarily associated with any particular player. Now, on these cards, you will find a year. You will find a command value. You'll find a picture that is associated with the event. You'll find an event title and then an event description. Now, how these are used, I'll explain once we talk about how the game is actually played. And finally, it is very handy to have two dice, one for each player. So then, let me explain the game board and the different elements you find there. On the game board, you'll find, most importantly, the morale track. The morale track is what we need in order to establish which side is actually winning the war. You win a game of Scarper by depleting your opponent from their morale and thus having them quit and give up on the war. So we've got the morale track on this side. Then we have the propaganda track, an economic track, and then in the middle of the board we have the different battlefields. The battlefields are represented by these connected spaces. The different battlefields have a name, which is represented in the middle of the battlefields, where the front line starts. So in order to set up for a game of Scarper, you'll need to do the following things. The event cards, which have that year on the top of them, need to be grouped into their representative piles. So there's going to be one pile for every year of World War I. So you have your 1914 cards, your 1915 cards, 16, 17, and 18. You place the morale marker on the 0 on the morale track. I use a gaming cube. On the sheet, it's the marker on the far top left. You also place markers on the propaganda track on the space 0 and on the economic track on the space 5. Now again, with the version you can find online, these are those red and blue markers. Finally, you place the front lines on the different battlefields. Now at the beginning of our game, where it's set in the fall of 1914, the front line would be on the spaces which have a name, the named spaces of the battlefields. Now again, I use my World War I miniatures to give the game a little bit more flavor, but the rules would be the same. Finally, you'll put two trenches on the spaces marked 1 on the battlefields which are furthest to the south. So that would be Metz, Colmar, and Mulhouse. These represent the defenses that were already in place at the beginning of World War I. So having discussed the setup of Scarper, let me take you through a round. Now rounds in Scarper are called years because each round represents 1 year of World War I. At the start of a year, place the markers on the propaganda track back on 0. You do not do this for the economic track. Secondly, players are dealt event cards. For 1914, each player receives 4 cards. For 1915, players receive cards back up to 5. The same goes for 1916 and 17, and in 1918, players are dealt back up to 4. Once players have received their event cards, they choose their strategy card for that year. A strategy card can be a propaganda card, which will give a propaganda bonus at the end of the year. It can be an economic card, which gives a bonus to their economy by the end of the year. Or it can be an advertisement, which doesn't give any bonus to them. So there's an element of bluffing involved there. During their action round, there are 6 types of actions a player can make. Firstly, a player can spend whatever money they have on their economic track to build trenches. By doing so, you lower your value on an economic track by 1 for every trench you'd wish to place anywhere on a battlefield. Now you have to do this before taking any other actions. Secondly, a player can start using the command points on their cards. Now, I explained that event cards come in 3 colors, red, blue, and green. This is why this is significant. If you play an event card, which is your color, you can choose whether you want to spend the command points or whether you want to use the event as described here. However, if you use a card which is associated with your opponent, you can use the command points, but the event will always happen because it's generally beneficial to your opponent. So you gotta be strategic about when to play events which are associated with your opponent and make sure that you limit the benefit they get from the event associated with the card. Now, there are 2 non-attack actions and 3 attack actions you can make by spending those points. You can spend points by investing in your economy, so maybe regaining some of the value you just spent on trenches. Or you can spend points on the propaganda track and gaining some further traction there. And remember, the building of the trenches has to be done before any other action is done. You cannot first invest in your economy and then go back to building trenches. Once you are done with your trenches, you are done with your trenches. Also, after placing attack and having moved the front line on a battlefield, you are not then allowed to build trenches. Only at the beginning of the action round can you place trenches.